needs more trust in God.
Absolutely. And you started that by saying you're not sure really by what Saul's waiting for. That's exactly how I felt. With him, by the way, a little note there. Did you spot who was with Saul and his company?
The priest.
Yeah. Ahijah. And who was Ahijah? It's very interesting that a connection is made back to some historical events we've already looked at.
Well, he was related to Phineas and eventually Eli.
Yeah, eventually Eli. He was the nephew of Ichabod, and Ichabod was the grandson of Eli. And of course, Ichabod was the glory of Ichabod from Israel, was the meaning of his name. So there's a sense in which the priesthood was kind of diminished in a way. But it made me ask the question, why in the world didn't Saul ask Ahijah to make this sacrifice earlier on?
I was wondering why they would mention him. So and that he was wearing an ephod.
Yes.
And it says in Deuteronomy, I believe 4, it shall be when you are on the verge of battle that the priest shall approach and speak to the people, and he shall say to them, Hear, O Israel, you are on the verge of battle with your enemies. Do not let your heart faint, do not be afraid, and do not tremble. Don't be terrified because of him, for the Lord your God is he who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies.
What impressed you about his faith?
The Lord would reveal to them, or he was trusting in, he's going up there with just his armor bearer, and he knows that a couple of things are probable, that it's spotted, and here's what they'll do if they do spot them, and here's how we will respond. He was willing to be on the attack.
Okay, what is the actual statement he makes that demonstrates his faith in God?
That's in verse 6. He says, Let us go over to the garrison of these uncircumcised. It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing restrains the Lord from saving by many or by few.
Right. I love that phrase. Saved by many or few. And few was two, like Mark's saying, it's just two of them. It's incredible to me. We know that there are 600 horsemen. Some accounts indicate that maybe the 30,000 chariots is an exaggeration. It may have been 3,000 chariots, but it doesn't really matter, does it? They're hugely outnumbered. Remember how many men did Saul have with him last week? He started off with 3,000, 1,000 with David, 2,000 with Saul. Excuse me, not David, Jonathan. And then got down to what? 600. So they're vastly outnumbered. 2 men. Jonathan has incredible faith. And he's willing to act upon his faith. Because as Mark said, what's at stake by this sign that he basically sets up for God to reveal to them whether they should fight or not? They have to reveal themselves. He's going to put himself in jeopardy. He's not just going to ask for a sign that is something that doesn't. And the kingdom had remained within his lineage. An incredible king, I think Jonathan would have made. All right. So that's the contrast, and then they spot something because Saul's lookouts see the Philistines are starting to dissipate. There's something going on in their camps, and so I asked this question: how would you assess Saul's actions after seeing the Philistine forces start to decline? What did you think about what he did? What did he do first of all, and then what did you think about what he did? Gage?
Well, he has to take count, see who's missing.
Okay.
But did one of us do this?
All right. And what did you think about that?
I thought it was a little bit strange, but I personally think it's a little bit strange that Jonathan went out and did this, because from a military standpoint, you don't just go out on your own and undertake your own mission, especially behind any sort of enemy lines.
Yeah. So it was very, very unusual. I mean, if we were thinking about a modern day scenario like this, we would probably think someone was absolutely out of their minds to do something like as risky as this. But he had a faith in God that it didn't matter how many were involved. And as we see in just a moment, God worked with that faith. But coming back to why he wanted to find out who was missing from the camp. What did you think about that? I mean, it is odd. What purpose could there be? Did it serve any military purpose? Did it advance their cause in some way against the Philistines to do this?
You just don't.
Suspicious rather than relief.
Yes, absolutely. And it just seems, here they are, there's a little bit of momentum in their favor in this situation, and he's delaying to go and find out who is from the camp is gone. So that's number one. What's the other thing that he does? That to me seemed, well, you can tell me what you think.
Well, that's what he calls the Ajax, it's in the arms.
Yes. What about that?
It's about that we're protected, or we go in front of us.
What does it remind us of a little bit?
Outnine Shanahan's, I guess, taking the ark to the battle.
Yeah, I mean, Eli's absolute horror of the capture of the ark we've already looked at. But again, I think we talked about this with Ethan brought out the idea that there was maybe some kind of mystical power that they had. This, they felt that the ark's presence was going to somehow do something for them in the battle here. But they've already got momentum. Yes.
The fact that there's an ephod there suggests that was it was part of the battle plan, because the 12 stones on the ephod signaled whether the Spirit of God was with them.
Okay.
And I don't know if they lit up or what, but it identified to them whether or not they were in the presence of God.
All right.
They don't tell us what the ephod says here.
Well, the ephod was some kind of garment, what Jim's alluding to here.
Well, I looked up in Numbers 27:21. It says, "He shall stand before Eleazar the priest, who shall inquire before the Lord for him by the judgment of the Urim. At his word they shall go out, and at his word they shall come in, he and all the children of Israel."
Okay.
Wearing that ephod.
Yes. So it seems like the ephod, the Bible tells us that the Urim and Thummim items, whatever they were, whether they were precious stones of some kind, I think one meant light and one meant purity, something of that sort. And it was a method of God communicating His will. I'm not sure exactly what those items did or how exactly they communicated His will, but they evidently lived in some kind of pouch. They were kept on the body, the person of the priest, in a pouch in the ephod. There's no description of that I know of in the Bible, but it is connected to the presence of the ephod.
Well, in this case, that ephod was completely out of context. It wasn't being used the way that it was supposed to, which means Saul didn't really understand what it was if he brought it with him to the battle for some sort of an advantage.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think the idea is potentially that the priest there was there. Ahijah was potentially asked, perhaps by Saul, we don't read anything, but maybe he was in there reaching for the Urim and Thummim, trying to work out what was going on. But again, it's a delay. It seems completely unnecessary. It seems to indicate to me that there's a degree of yes.
And he's fumbling around trying to come up with
He was, absolutely. So he was very much a follower rather than leader. His son was the leader, and he was the follower. But eventually he decides to go into battle. And so I've asked the question here, I think Mark was alluding to some of this a moment ago, how did God use the Philistines' armament advantage to the advantage of the Israelites? How did that work? What did he do?
Turn them against themselves.
I love this. I just think it's so great that God can do the most unexpected things, and that the seemingly insurmountable advantage. Why was it that they had this advantage? We didn't really have time to look at this last week in chapter 13, but what was the reason?
Well, only Jonathan and Saul had swords.
Yes,
And
but
so they all had swords.
why was it
because
that they only had
all the
swords?
people who did the sharpening.
Yes, the Philistines had kind of had their garrisons, and they were some sort of occupying force with an influence that could stop. They could basically cancel, if you like, the whole idea of the Israelites having any access to their own blacksmiths. And so they had to take all their agricultural implements for sharpening and forging to these blacksmiths. So, yes, so God basically turns them on themselves. We might say they eat their own. What does it remind you of a principle that Jesus taught? Does it remind you of? Yes, exactly. That's what I was thinking of. Matthew 12, house divided cannot stand. And so a man acts with faith, and then God builds upon it and works with it.
Just back to one of your previous questions about what Jonathan was looking for, trying to analyze about their force. My thought is perhaps he was looking to see who the leadership was and what they were doing. But they're confused by the earthquake, the trembling, and the confusion that it causes, and then the Lord turning them on one another.
Yes.
And so the Lord has, just like he set up the force of Gideon at a great advantage, he set up the Philistines.
Yes. That's right.
To the advantage of Jonathan to lead it here.
What started to happen once the tide in the battle turned? Did you notice that?
Other people started coming out, like the people of Ephraim.
Does it remind you of anything going on at the moment politically? I just thought of all of these billionaires have suddenly started switching their allegiance to Donald Trump. They see the tide turning, and there are Hebrews who evidently had passively followed into the camp of the Philistines. I'm not sure exactly what was going on here, but they somehow were, I don't know whether they were looking for security among them or what, but anyway, they weren't with the rest of the people of Israel. They kind of, it seems, had switched sides, and then they started fighting against them at that point. And then some others. What else happened on top of all that? Did you notice someone else that came out?
It says the men of Israel who had hidden in the mountains of Ephraim.
Yeah, remember we read the 3,000 had dwindled to 600. Some of them had gone across the Jordan. Some of them had hidden into caves and other places. And they came out as well. So, the typical kind of, you see the way the tide is turning and you jump on the winning side kind of situation. But anyway, God worked all that. And then there was something else going on in the background, all of that God worked to add to the confusion and fear probably in the eyes of the Philistines. What was that? Do you notice? I believe it was a literal thing. I believe it was something that actually happened. An earthquake, wasn't it? Did you notice that?
Well, that was mentioned, but where do you see that?
Verse 15.
Thank you. The earthquake, and there became a very great panic. I believe that was literal. I thought about it and looked into it a little bit to see whether it might have been some kind of metaphorical thing, but I believe it was a literal earthquake that also created a great panic and fear. All right, yes.
I looked for a picture of that valley, and it's a very deep ravine.
Okay.
And it's, as the Bible describes, these are very sharp rocks, they're jagged cliffs. I could see one side, and there's a series of cliffs side by side, but the pictures doesn't show the ones on the photographic side. And so it was treacherous ground, and so the Lord didn't have to do a lot, but what He did, what was brought about,
Yes.
change gave
Yes.
the advantage to Israel.
So there was a battle, and they put the Philistines into flight. But there's a curse pronounced by Saul. What was the
It went from somebody who didn't know what to do to now it's all about me. Look
Right.
what I've done.
Absolutely. What was the role and mission that God gave Saul? Do you remember?
Fight the battles.
To lead his people.
Well, it was to lead, but specifically, it was very much like the mission he gave each of the judges. What was it? Do you remember? Save Israel from her enemies. That was his mission. To preserve God's people as a result of that, but to save Israel from their mission. Instead, he turned it into avenge me of my enemies. This goes back to my opening comment about the kind of transparency and honesty of the Bible, but you see Saul's attitudes kind of flip-flop around here, and this is not a good attitude. And so the people are already tired, and the people, I'm not sure, I go both ways, whether there was the people as a whole, as well as those actually doing the fighting, or just the men doing the fighting. But anyway, they've been pursuing the Philistines, they're exhausted. What does Jonathan make of this curse?
He doesn't know about it at first.
Okay, it doesn't know about it, but later on when he hears about it, remember how he describes it?
Well, in verse 29, my father has troubled the land.
Yes.
Look now how my countenance is brightened because I tasted a little bit of the honey.
Yes.
So
The idea of that my father's trouble, he's laid an additional burden on the people. It's like, what does that remind you of? The idea of laying a burden on the people.
Pharaoh for one.
The Pharisees.
All right, yeah, that's true.
The Pharisees.
Yeah. They laid a burden on the people that they themselves wouldn't lift a finger to lift and help them. He's troubled the land. Saul's selfish motive here for this curse had what result?
Well,
It made his people weaker.
Yeah.
So
And as a result of the weakness and their weariness, there were actually two things that happened. But what was the most immediate thing that happened?
They started killing animals and just eating them with the blood.
Okay, there's that. But in general terms, I probably should have been more specific.
well, Jonathan said they probably could have defeated a lot more.
Yeah. A lot of them got away. A lot of them regrouped to fight another day. In fact, we see later in the chapter that there's this reference to the fact that the Philistines in particular are singled out as continuing to provide a lot of resistance to Saul all the way through his kingship. And really, God's obedience was diminished. I mean, the obedience to God and what he expected of Saul and the Israelites was diminished by this. There was a less complete destruction of these people, and therefore there was less complete obedience to what God commanded. All because of Saul's selfish motive here. And so he did this. Now coming back to what you said, Sylvia, I asked this question here. Do you think Saul bears any blame for his men eating animals with their blood? What did you think?
Yeah.
Okay, how so?
Well, it was just, for whatever reason, I just look at it as a stupid thing. Like, so he did this and put them in that position where they were starving.
I liken this to the idea that we see in Scripture of a snare, that there's a situation set up that is a potential trap for us, that there's a potential vulnerability created potential temptation, an occasion for sin. This was an occasion for sin. How do we know how bad it was among these people in terms of their kind of eagerness to eat these animals with blood?
Well, Jeremy, I see that, you know, through this whole campaign, Saul has not been in control. He has no military plan. Part of that military plan would be to make sure that your troops have something to eat.
Right.
Jonathan recognizes he is wore out, flat tired, and he can get, all he's doing is dipping a little bit of honey as he runs by.
Yeah.
It's not as though he's sitting down, he's going to take a 2-day
That's right.
rest. And so now they're at the end of the battle, and Saul still has no plan
Yeah.
for feeding these troops, bringing the troops back together and providing them with what they need. And so he left them open
He did.
and with no plan. It's every man for himself.
So I believe that, you know, it sounds like you're agreeing with the Saul did bear some blame for what happened here. But coming back to the question, how do we know that they were so desperate to eat this food with the blood?
In verse 32, it says the people rushed on the spoil.
Yeah.
They were faint before it. It said they rushed on the
Yeah.
spoil, took sheep, and they slaughtered them on the ground, and started eating.
So the account says that, and then who else says that? And how does he say it? A little later on. I think, and if I'm not mistaken, I think Samuel talks about how the people fell upon the food greedily. The Virgin may say something else, but there's the sense in which they pounced on it, which is an interesting word. But the idea that there was a
Jeremy, I think you may be in chapter 15 when it comes to the Amalekites. Samuel does say that.
yes,
That they fell upon the spoil.
yes.
But I don't think it's mentioned in 14.
And I'm just thinking about the idea that there was more to it than what Saul later says about why they fell on this food. There was an extreme exhaustion and hunger. What did you think about Saul's criticism of what they did? Verse 33, I guess, of chapter 14.
He says, you have done such and such. You have sinned.
What did you think about his kind of criticism of them?
We're going back, we go from Saul having no plan and God giving this great victory to then Saul coming up with a plan and it's a bad plan. And then Saul saying, look what you did, people.
Right.
Instead of owning, we don't see anywhere that God told them,
Right.
don't eat while.
Right.
And so even when he does make plans, it's not good.
It just struck me as well as so hypocritical, because he's just already been disobedient in his own practices, and then what is when he basically instructs the people? What struck you about what he told them to do with regard to the slaughtering the animals? Did anything strike you about that?
He said, roll a great stone to me.
Yeah. So he's just made, again, it's all about him. It's a very messy situation. I think it's ironic that Saul obviously thought there was more work to be done about avenging himself, because look at verse 36. Let's go down to the Philistines and plunder them. He has to be reminded by Ahijah to ask God, seek his view upon that. But they're already eating, and he's not fully avenged. Yet he's just said, curse me anyone who eats before I'm fully avenged. They're just so inconsistent, so kind of flip-flopping back and forwards. So, as someone said, Jonathan didn't know anything about this curse. He eats, he eats. It's not exactly like a meal. He tips, as you said, he just dips his staff into the honey. And so the question there asked, what character traits are seen in Saul with regard to dealing with Jonathan, particularly in these verses? Let me see. Huh?
Well, we've named several have named the things that he's weak.
Yeah.
So he's just like Israel. Saul is just doing what the Israel did under the judges. Every man was doing what was right in his own eyes.
Yes.
And sometimes a very small percentage of the people did what was right. A small percentage of the judges. So he's floundering, he's relying on himself rather than relying on the Lord. Or he may have been thinking about how other kings had acted towards Israel. He makes these rash, inexplicable mistakes that people make when they're not relying on God. And your point last week about the book of the Kings.
Yes.
He needed that knowledge. He needed to think about Moses and his leadership, and what he knew from what had been given so far. And he's making all the mistakes that a person without solid faith would make. And it's ironic that Jonathan's not. He's got a son who's doing really well.
Gage.
Well, along with that, I mean, the only people that ever rebuke Saul for what he's doing are Jonathan and Samuel. And there's a phrase that's been repeated several times in the last few chapters that the people say, do whatever you think is right. And it just surprises me that Saul doesn't have any advisors around him that say, hey, Saul, this is not a good idea. You want to feed the men. Saul, this is not a good idea. I mean, to their credit.
What struck you about how he dealt with Jonathan? I found this shocking.
I don't know, he was faithful to what he said, even though it was his son. I thought that was, when you add the character traits, I mean, he said, I'm going to do it, and he was sticking with what he said.
Well, that's true. That wasn't what shocked me. But there's no regret. There's no regret. There's no question. There's no question about what happened. What was the circumstance of this? What did he actually do? Remember that Jonathan went off against this garrison and triggered this whole situation with the Philistines without telling his father. He'd already done that one time before, seemingly. And so I'm wondering whether there's a degree of anger and resentment at his son acting kind of unilaterally on his own like this, not talking to him about what he was thinking of doing militarily. Sort of, like you said about a moment ago about his rash, he invokes a curse upon himself as a result of this, which ultimately does come back onto him because he doesn't actually fulfill this vow or this curse.
Yeah, he's
coming back on him later on. God does do to him.
Yeah, and those are prideful things. Those are anger issues.
Yes.
That come out in his dealing with David. It just leads to a bad mindset.
What about with people? So, as we've said, they step in and defend Jonathan. They believe that he was collaborating. They point specifically to the fact that he and God were working together to achieve this victory. So they're ready to defend him. Well, what's Saul's?
To the king,
Yes.
that's not going to happen today.
He just caves in, doesn't he? And yet he's been, just a moment ago invoking this curse. He threatened death on anyone that ate until he was avenged. Suddenly that's out of the window. He's completely inconsistent. He's been kind of just abandoned the whole purpose of pursuing the Philistines at this point.
Well, it's not depending on God at all.
No.
The end of verse 52 says, and when Saul saw any mighty man or any valiant man, he attached him to his staff. So he's looking not to God, but to man.
You know, that reminds me, and you know, I'm British, obviously, and I listen to American patriotism, often with a lot of admiration. But one thing that worries me a great deal is the stock that many in this country place in the military power of this country, and the pride attached to, you know, the claim that it's the strongest fighting force on earth. That really worries me. And it's a bit like Saul's attitude is that he's going to win by having these mighty men around him, not because of his trust in God being able to save by many or by few, like Jonathan. So yes, lots of problematic character traits. And we see this chapter finishing out with Saul's wars against the various people. He does seem to be following through with his basic mission to save Israel from her enemies. Moab, Ammon, Edom, Zobar, and then the Philistines, who continue to provide. It seems as though God, through Samuel, has to remind Saul that they too are a long-standing enemy of God that needs to be dealt with, because they seemingly haven't been dealt with in this listing here. So the question here is, what does God's command against the Amalekites reveal about his nature and attitude towards the people? What do you think about that?
I think that he is going to carry through with what he said. You know, when Amalek wouldn't let them pass through, he said he was going to bring judgment upon them. If you look at it from Israel's standpoint, it seems like, well, God said he was going to do that. He hasn't done it yet.
Yes.
But now we see him carrying it out.
All right. So God's punishment for those that are unrepentant is certain. It doesn't matter how long it's going to take. It doesn't matter how much delay there could be. And of course, the delay, could be, as we read in 2 Peter, the idea of God providing time for repentance to take place. That delay isn't just God delaying for no purpose at all. Was it Gage, or who did I see? I saw a hand. Yes, Jim.
Seems to me that our discussion this morning is looking for context for this whole story. And there is context. There's a really big picture. Part of it starts back in the wilderness when Moses goes up on the mountain and Israel commits idolatry and all this story. And God's response to that is, these are worthless people. I'm going to destroy them utterly. That's the oath that he made to Moses. And Moses said, well, now wait a minute, maybe we can work something out. And so this story this morning is continuing from that point. As you get to Joshua, they have to take this land that I've given them. Well, that's not the kind of thing you do if you're expected to give somebody something. But anyway, we find ourselves on down here in these prophecies and the Old Testament, following that story, and we get to a point like this we're at this morning, and here's Saul incompetent. And the only chance, in fact, he's looking to start a war that he didn't have to have. And he doesn't know any better. We've got Jonathan, however, who, if we read ahead a little bit, Jonathan's soul is knitted to David's soul, which means in God's context, David was there as well. And he was going to be the king later. I know this is not fair, because when you read a book, you don't usually go read the end of it before you come back to the middle. But that's the way you have to look at the New Testament. It's all completely out of context.
Okay.
Now, if we were a Berean in the first century, looking at this story, they'd be challenged exactly the same way we are. And they were 1,000 years, and I know I'm taking your
right. We must always remember the context of the Bible, what came before. We can take some comfort in the fact that God sees and remembers all the evil done by men.
He says he will avenge.
Yes, and he will avenge. And that avenging is, for those who are unrepentant, it's total and utter destruction, as Jim was saying. It's total and utter destruction. So, Saul does actually obediently get together a large army and goes to fight Amalek. I believe he shows a degree of mercy that's commendable. Again, it shows the honesty of the account. He goes to the Kenites and says what to the Kenites? What are they to do? And why are they to do it?
Get out of there, I'm going to destroy you too.
Okay. And as I think Jim was alluding perhaps to this, but it was Jethro, Moses' son, is a Kenite. Son and father-in-law is a Kenite. And so there was a lot of help given by Kenites to the Israelites through their wanderings in the wilderness. And so that was remembered. Saul, to his credit, gets them out of the way before he begins to fight Amalek. And so they are defeated, and they're chased all the way down to what is modern day Saudi Arabia. Insecurities and egotistical tendencies, despite the beginning of his reign being, I think, marked with a degree of humility, which is commendable. It just goes off the rails increasingly as his kingdom continues. Thanks so much for your comments. I'm sorry we're running out of time this morning. There's so much that we could have talked about, but Ethan can pick it up next week.